We're going to talk about the Revolution, and of course we're going to talk about some battles, we're going to talk about some heroes, because we all learned that kind of stuff when we were in school, is to talk about the impact of something like this on the average person who lived in Rhode Island at the time frame. We typically seem to discount the amount of time that we here in Rhode Island were a part of the British Empire. We were a colony, and we forget about that, and we give it short shift. But the important thing is to remember that for 140 years, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations was part of the British Empire. My family is a perfect example, a little extreme, but an example of how that would have impacted 5 generations of my family, from the first ones who came here in 1637 to the 5th generation who signed up and went to fought the British, were loyal British subjects. And this loyalty extended from generation to generation. So if you think about that, then you've got to figure that what happened to make all of these loyal British subjects, generation upon generation. You were born here, you were a British subject. You died here, you were a British subject. Your children were British subjects. What made them change their minds and decide to do what they wanted to do? So it was a bold and a brave move that they did, and that's kind of what we're going to focus on to a larger part. Yes, we'll talk about a few heroes, and yes, we'll name off some battles, but really I want you to have a sense, an understanding of what people were going through in the 1770s and early 1780s. What was going through their mind, what their lives were like, and the impact of this on them and their families. One thing that's interesting about Wickford is it's one of the few places in the southern Narragansett Bay that actually prospered during the Revolution. And actually the Revolution had turned out to be a good thing for Wickford, and we'll talk about that crazy fact as well. I do want to talk a little bit more about people's thoughts on this business when they were here. And I think it was not an easy choice, is the bottom line for most people. I mean, we'd think about it and think, oh yeah, they decided just to give it up, but it was not an easy choice. They all got together, each of the colonies decided independently, and then they got together and decided they were going to do this. We're breaking away from the British Empire. We're done with this. They got together, they signed a Declaration of Independence, they handed it off to the powers that be, and then they got back and met in the very first Continental Congress, and they all got panicky. They all got panicky. If you look at history, you look at the realization that these men who signed their name, they were traitors. They were traitors. They were subject to be hung. They knew that. And anybody who supported this cause, this revolution here in New England, was subject to hanging. And they started to be in a panic. Everything is going crazy, and they're all thinking, what do we do? What have we done? What have we done? We could all be hung. And Benjamin Franklin, of all people, one of the elder statesmen at the time, stood up, raised his hand, got everybody's attention. They all sat down, and he said one simple sentence, which kind of sums up everything that was going on after the die was cast in places like Wickford, Newport, all up and down through the colonies. Franklin says, "Gentlemen, we must all hang together. If we don't, we will surely hang separately." A great Franklin quote, but that really sums up what was going on in the minds of everybody who decided we're going to do this thing, because it was a huge move. I mean, we're a ragtag little bunch of colonies with no real military, no real navy, and we're up against the powerhouse of the entire world at that time frame. Imagine how brave they were to take that risk. So from here, we're going to walk around and go to 9 places. Not a lot of walking, an awful lot of history in a short period of time. I've been doing this for a long time, more than a quarter of a century. If you'd been a walk with me 25 years ago and you asked me a question, I would probably dissolve into a puddle and wouldn't know what to do. But my train of thought would be gone. But here, my train of thought, if it goes off the tracks, it's fine. I get it right back on. So, and my wife says I'm a big, giant talking head. So let's make it a dialogue rather than a monologue from this big, giant talking head. So if you have questions, you have ideas, you have things you want to put out there, feel free to just raise your hand or speak up. From here, we're just going to walk a short way and go to a house of a gentleman named Captain Tom Cole and see what he had to do with all of this. So follow me. So Thomas Cole, interesting guy, house carpenter, regular old guy, living in the village. The Coles were like my family. From the 1600s, the Coles were here in Wickford. The Coles were here on the West Bay from the very beginning. And again, 5 or 6 generations of Coles were here and were loyal citizens of the British Empire and loyal to whoever was wearing the crown. But, you know, time went on and they decided to jump aboard onto the idea of the revolution, becoming a revolutionary and breaking away from England. So what did Tom do? He's interesting. He signed up in the military in the very beginning and served a total of 8 years. Essentially the entire American Revolution, Thomas Cole served here. As you can see, his house was constructed after the war. The Coles lived in a different location before the war. He came here and built this house afterwards. And Tom is one of those guys who was a hero, and is one of those people that we're going to talk about the kinds of things that Tom Cole did. Tom Cole was involved in the Siege of Boston, the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Harlem Heights, the Battle of White Plains, the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, and the Battle of the Red Bank. He served with General Washington at Valley Forge and survived through that harsh winter when many other men deserted. Tom Cole stood by and stayed there. After that, he began to know his time in Valley Forge was good for him in making connections to the people who were in the leadership roles as the war raged on and things were beginning to look a little bleak for the colonies, to be frank. They were running out of men, they were running out of money, and we're going to talk about those two things at this stop and the next one. First and foremost, they were running out of men. Men were getting tired of fighting in the war. They were running out of people to serve in the war, and Washington got together with Christopher Green and had an interesting idea about how we can get more manpower in here. And what they did was they ended up forming the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, also known as the Black Regiment. It was an interesting concept. It's the very first black regiment in the entire history of the United States. And it wasn't just black people. There was Native Americans involved in this as well, and mixed race people. Lots of people in this area were part black and part Native people, and they were also involved in this. There are actually even a few white soldiers in this regiment as well. And as this regiment was formed, the black soldiers, particularly the ones who were slaves, were offered freedom if they served. If they served out the full remainder of the war, they would be offered freedom. It all sounds pretty grand, doesn't it? But I always want to be honest about what was going on in these situations. Another part of the opportunity for this was, of course, to get manpower to fight in the war and to show that we could put a regiment together and to show all the other new states that black men could fight alongside their white counterparts and fight with honor. But it was also an opportunity for wealthier white people who were up against it, because each colony which had become a state had a quota of men they were supposed to supply each year to continue for the war effort, as well as each colony that is now a state had a quota of monies they were supposed to give into the cause. And at this opportunity, what we had was a situation where slave-owning white men who did not want to have to worry about a quota could give one of their slaves to go serve in their place. So this did happen. And I don't want to not mention that, because it's very nice to think about what Tom and Christopher Green did, and this reality does not detract from what they did. Indeed, they formed this unit out of blacks and Native Americans, many of whom, a good portion of were slaves, and they were ready to go. They wanted their freedom, and this was a quick avenue to get that. And interestingly enough, and it speaks to the amount of enslaved and indentured people in North Kingstown, North Kingstown actually had more members in this regiment than any other community. And the realities of that are that in the time frame of the early 1700s up to the point of the Revolutionary War, that North Kingstown, as part of South County and the Narragansett Planter Society that existed here then, at its peak had 20% of our population in North Kingstown was enslaved or indentured. So think about that idea. 20% of the people in North Kingstown were enslaved or indentured in some of these critical time frames. And that's why we ended up with 22 or 24 men who were either black or mixed race that were slaves signing up and looking for their freedom.
What's the population?
Population of North Kingstown, a few thousand. Yeah, a few thousand at that time frame. And the Rhode Island Black Regiment was formed by Christopher Green along with Tom Cole, and they trained them in a hurry and got them out to fight in the war, to kind of reinforce the people who were there, particularly as the Battle of Rhode Island, which was a battle over the control of Aquidneck Island. As you probably are aware, the British and the Hessians, and we'll talk a little bit more about those on another walk, another stop, had taken over Portsmouth, Middletown, and Newport. Essentially, they took over that entire island, and a battle was to ensue to free that island. And this regiment was sent off to reinforce the folks, and that battle began. And this Black Regiment served with honor and distinction and bravery, and indeed served so well that other states began to think about the realities of, we need men. We have our quotas that we have to fulfill. This is a way we can move forward. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment after that battle was then merged with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, which was a white regiment, and they became the very first mixed regiment of black and white men serving together, and went on to serve with honor at Saratoga? Yeah, I'm sorry, I blanked out on there. And they served with honor then as well, and continued to serve throughout the remainder of the war to fulfill their obligation. And when they mustered out, all of the former slaves were given their freedom. So it's a great opportunity for them, and it was a great opportunity for the state of Rhode Island to put together a unit and continue to fulfill their obligations to the cause as far as manpower goes. Okay, we're going to walk around the corner and talk about that other obligation that they had, which was financial obligations. Each colony, now a state, had financial obligations towards the war, and how did Rhode Island and many of the other colonies fulfill those obligations? We'll talk about it at our next stop. All right, a fantastic home, you have to admit. This is a beautiful home. It was built for a member of the Updike family when Wickford was just beginning, built in the style of a Newport mansion of its time frame, and it was a statement house. The Updikes wanted to make a statement. This is our place. We are the Updikes. We're somebody special, and you can see the house definitely says that. There's tons of stories that go along with this house. It's one of the most storied houses in the village. But today we're going to talk about the time frame during the Revolution. It was owned by a gentleman named Thomas Cutler. Now, Thomas Cutler was a trader, an East Indies trader who was here living in Wickford, taking advantage of the maritime business that were going on here in Wickford. And Wickford at this time frame, right before the war, was deep into this idea of trading. And what this really is a trader would charter a ship, buy a cargo, and fill the ship up with the cargo and send it off to somewhere. Let's use an easy Wickford kind of example. Let's say he bought a cargo of salted cod. And he filled the ship up with wooden casks of salted cod. He's going to take it down to a place where they need that kind of thing. We'll say Baltimore. He fills his ship up with salted cod. Off he goes. He offloads the salted cod and sells it there. He takes the proceeds from the salted cod, buys another whole cargo, fills the ship up with stuff that is not available in the Narragansett Bay, maybe fancy furniture or fabrics or fine clothes, the kind of things you could buy in a big city like Baltimore, window glass, dishes, brings that cargo back up here and then resells it for a profit. And that's how traders would make their money. And he was good at it. He was able to buy this fine house and live in it. But the one thing about Thomas Cutler was that he was a loyalist. You've probably heard the word loyalist and also the word Tory, which are interchangeable. And what they mean is these are people at this time frame who had no interest in this incredible chance to break away from the British Empire, and the risk that it posed to him was particularly from a business perspective. All of his connections, his business connections, had to do with things that were a part of the British Empire, and he didn't want to see those connections severed. So he walked around the village talking about this, and he was a proud, arrogant man like so many others of his type, and he said, "You people are fools. You will all hang. I'll stand there. I'll watch you hang. I can't believe you're doing this." Any people he knew, he would reach up to them and try to convince them not to do it. Finally, it got to the point where he was stirring up so much trouble, particularly in the area of Wickford, and there were other folks in the area doing it. George Room, who was a Newport businessman who had a Summers estate on the land we now call Rome Point. He too was here complaining about the idea of breaking away from the British Empire. And again, he had his own reasons for that, and most of them had to do with the breakup of business connections that he had with the British Empire, and that was where his bread and butter was. So all of these people are out there, and as the war went on and things started to turn a little bit, not so good, people were starting to listen to these people. And the fledgling government of Rhode Island decided we have to take action. But the other thing they knew in the back of their mind as the war was raging on is they were beginning to fall behind on the amount of money that they guaranteed they would put into the coffers of the government of the new country of the United States and in order to fund the war. They're thinking, how can we come up with this money? So they had a great idea. It's a Rhode Island idea, yeah, I'll have to tell you. It's a straight out Rhode Island idea. People like Thomas Cutler and George Room, they went to the brand new Rhode Island state government and said, we want to pass a bill saying that traders like this, we have the ability to confiscate all of their properties and sell them at auction to help fund the war effort. And indeed, what's happened? Thomas Cutler's fine house was taken away from him. He was arrested, told, you can go back to England right now, or you can go in jail, but we are taking all your property. George Room, and they had auctions all the time, auctioning off the properties, and this was a large way that the colony, now state of Rhode Island, funded the war effort by confiscating the properties of wealthy loyalists and selling them off. Can't beat that. That's a great idea, isn't it? That'll teach you to keep your mouth, not to keep your mouth shut. And it's interesting because these guys had no connections, and there were a lot of people who were loyalists who kept their mouths shut, average people who kept their mouths shut and did other things. And there were even some loyalists who were prominent who didn't end up with the same kind of result that folks like these guys did. Indeed, George Room, we talked about, was the primary example. He actually wrote a letter back to people in London, kind of telling about what was going on here in Rhode Island. And the letter, again, ended up in the hands of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin brought it back to George Washington, and Room was also then in trouble with the new U.S. government as well. So these kind of things occurred, and they were drummed out of the new country, but all of their stuff was left behind. And indeed, in an ironic fashion, these wealthy loyalists helped fund the war effort. All right,
Did he ever get out of jail?
He did. He went out of jail. He was turned over. Both of them were turned over to the British in Newport, and they went off back to England to obscurity, I guess. Yep. Yep. We're going to walk up the street a little way and talk about another interesting hero, Sam Phillips. Okay, Sam Phillips is our second guy that truly made his mark during the Revolution and came back to Wickford, a hero. And I like to think about Tom Cole and Sam Phillips being back here and going to the local taverns and telling stories about all the things they did. And Sam here had a heck of a story to tell. The Phillips family was a wealthy, wealthy family, and he could have very well probably have gotten out of serving. But Sam Phillips was really ardently in support of the Revolution. He really was, and he had already, and it's interesting because he had spent much of his time, he's already a trained military officer because he had served in the Kentish Guard alongside Nathaniel and Christopher Green and all the other folks in the Kentish Guard. And the Kentish Guard, it's just as an aside, is an interesting organization. It's one of these little local militia groups, but you know, it was run by Nathaniel Green, and it was in East Greenwich, Warwick area. That was where it was centralized. And Nathaniel Green was really in the beginnings of the Revolution, and he was involved in all the very beginnings of Rhode Island, deciding that this is what they were going to do. They were going to be done with this. And Nathaniel Green indeed went up to Boston and got involved with the Patriots up in Boston, and began smuggling guns out of Boston to bring down to Rhode Island to be ready for when the war broke out. He had a great idea. He had to think outside of the box mind, Nathaniel. He knew that, of course, anything coming out of Boston at that time frame was really being scrutinized by the British, who were already there in Boston and kind of holding that city hostage as well, just like Newport. He wanted to get these guns down into Rhode Island, and what he did is he went in with an empty wagon up to Boston from Warwick and East Greenwich area. Went in there, went into a local stable, had the wagon filled with horse manure, and then went to the place where he was going to get the guns. And all the guns were wrapped in oilskin and were buried under the horse manure, and none of the British redcoats wanted to dig through that horse manure to find the guns. And he did this time and time again. They're probably, how much fertilizer do you need, Mr. Green? But whatever, it worked for him, and he was able to outfit the Kentish Guard with that. One trip when he was up there with getting guns, he went into a tavern in Boston and saw over there a disgruntled-looking British drill sergeant sitting at the bar drinking. His name was Daniel Box. He went over and started drinking with him and convinced Daniel Box somehow to defect. So Daniel Box took off his red coat uniform, put on a set of clothes like Nathaniel Green, and helped him haul a bunch of guns out of Boston down here to southern Rhode Island. And when he got here, because he was a British drill sergeant, his skill set allowed the Kentish Guard to be the most regimented and professional unit that anybody had ever seen. George Washington remarked when he saw these ragtag units coming together at the beginning of the war, "Look at this group. Who's their leader? Nathaniel Green." That's why Nathaniel Green ended up being the powerhouse that he was in the Revolution, because he had this uncanny ability to think outside the box, and indeed ended up with Daniel Box. Daniel Box, as a part of the Revolution, ended up being a major in the Revolution and spent the remainder of his days living in Providence. So it's kind of a neat story. But let's get back to Sam Phillips. Now he knows all these people involved in the war, and he immediately gets involved in the war when it gets started. So he signs up to be in the Army first and starts out. Because of his connections with Nathaniel Green, he meets up with William Barton of Warwick, who ran another unit that was similarly well trained, and they got together. They had this grand idea. Over in Newport, on this impenetrable fortress, so the British thought, I mean, it's an island, was General Prescott. General Prescott was holed up in a beautiful Portsmouth mansion house, and he was the leader of the entire British forces in all of southeastern Rhode Island and into southeastern Massachusetts. He was the big cheese in this area right now, living a life of leisure over there, surrounded by British regulars and these Hessian mercenaries that were here. And these Hessian mercenaries were essentially just what a mercenary sounds like. They were folks who were trained warriors, and they just went from war to war and fought. They thought, if we could somehow kidnap Prescott, we are going to strike a blow that the British will never be able to overcome. They thought about it for quite a while. They didn't know how they would pull it off. I mean, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of troops in Newport that were under control of Prescott. But they got wind of something through a spy that Barton and Phillips knew, who was going back and forth between Newport and the West Bay. The British had captured a French merchant ship in the beginning of July that was its major part of its cargo was wine and French spirits. Almost the entire ship was essentially full of booze. Now, Barton and Phillips realized that this was going to be their opportunity. So when the ship was offloaded, and their spy told them the ship is offloaded, and yes, indeed, they're passing all this stuff out around to boost the morale of the Hessians and the British regulars, now's our night. Happened to be a moonless night. They got together with 40 volunteers and 5 whaleboats and left from the West Bay, rowed across the Narragansett Bay over to Portsmouth, left the largest portion of the group there at the whaleboats to make sure they were going to be there, and a handful of men, handpicked by Barton and Phillips, snuck in to this mansion house that Prescott was living in Portsmouth. I mean, they're literally stepping over drunken Germans, going by drunken British guys like this. They walk right into Prescott's bedroom, He's in his beautiful nightshirt, sound asleep. They grab him up, they stuff something in his mouth, they each grab him under each arm, and they slowly walk him back through all the drunken Germans and British regulars, down to the whaleboats, bring him back over here, and before you know it, he's in jail in Warwick. The leader of the British forces in New England is in jail in Warwick because of these guys with this great idea and this knowledge that they had about this cargo that was coming in here. Now you can imagine when Prescott's aide-de-camp woke up and opened the door to his general's bedroom and he saw no general, no general. So they eventually reached out to them. Nathaniel Greene and his people reached out to the British and said, "We got your general." And they publicized it all over the place. This indeed was a turning point for the war here. It boosted the morale of all of the folks in New England fighting these battles to know that we could capture the general who was leading all the commanding forces of all of the British Empire here in Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. And it pierced the idea of the British that they were invincible, that there's no way they're going to lose. The tides of war turned, not on just that, but this is one of the events that helped turn the tides of war, is this bold, daring capture of General Prescott done by Phillips and Barton and their 38 men. Really a remarkable time in the war, and he wasn't even done yet. This is his end of his first year in service to the war. He's done. He's already a hero. He could have just hung up his gun and went home, but he immediately, because he had been a mariner beforehand, then signed up as the U.S. Navy began and served 4 more years in the U.S. Navy, being a lead officer on the Tartar, the Assurance, and the Mifflin, and then retired after serving for 6 or 7 years in service to this new nation, and came back to his little house, now with the rank of major, and an awful lot of great stories to tell. So he really was a hero, along with Tom Cole, and as I said, those two guys got in the bar together. I'm sure there were stories to be told every day for the rest of their lives. Great stories indeed. Prescott was eventually traded for a half a dozen high-ranking American officers that had been captured all up and down the eastern seaboard. They wanted him. He was, a lot of these high-ranking officials were lords and earls and such, and Prescott was well connected back in London, and it was pay any price to get him back. And they did. They got back about a half a dozen high-ranking American officers who were captured and held by the British in order to get him back.
Did he stay here and fight after that?
Prescott? No, he went back to England. He was done. He was humiliated. Humiliated. Yep. All right, we're going to walk back down the way and walk up Fowler Street and talk about another aspect of the story here in Wickford and how it affected both enterprise, business enterprise, and the free blacks who were here. Okay, this is the Domini Smith house. It's a very attractive full cape. And when I was going through the history of all the houses, it befuddled me for quite a while because I wasn't looking in the right places for information about the first owner, and was something I really wanted to learn about the first owner with all these houses and what they were all about, just to begin to create a storyline for the house. And I was looking in the wrong place for Domini Smith. There were plenty of people named Smith, but I thought, well, the first name like Domini, this ought to be easy to figure out. But the problem was had a preconceived idea that because of this beautiful little house, that he had to be a white guy. And I was wrong. So anyhow, Domini Smith was a black man. He had spent his early life as a slave on the Smith House farm up on Post Road. Not Smith's Castle, but kind of across the street. Another Smith family was up there. And using our Rhode Islandese, we'll say it's where the post office is now. Or if you've been around long enough, I can say it's where Almack's used to be. So that was the Smith's farm. Domini worked there as a slave. And the Smiths, though, were Quakers. And indeed, the Quaker faith began to really advocate against slavery. And the Quakers were one of the first group of folks in the colonial period and then as we became a state that really continued to advocate against slavery and discuss the evils of slavery, and eventually Domini's masters freed him, along with a number of other slaves that they had in response to what they wanted to do as far as their Quaker beliefs. But Domini was special because, as so many other black men in the time frame, if you think about an agricultural slave, of course, we think about agricultural slaves, we immediately connect them with the South and the cotton plantations and the tobacco plantations. And those are areas where there's agricultural stuff going on year-round. But here in New England, of course, there's periods of time where there's not stuff going on year-round. So you buy a slave, and you have to pardon the language here, it just have to be the harsh realities of it all, and you expect to get your money's worth out of this purchase you had. Just like when you buy an oxen, you want to get what you paid for out of this thing. And what happened in New England when you have, once the crop's planted, you got a long time before anything really happens. What are you going to do with your agricultural slaves? And then, of course, throughout the winter, what do you do with them all? They're not really bringing back anything on your investment in them. And so what they did was they took most of the male slaves and trained them in a trade. And what they would do then was then rent out their slave in the times when they didn't need them, oftentimes to tradesmen, and then the slave didn't get the salary, the slave's owner got the salary. And many slaves were trained to be carpenters' helpers, bricklayers' helpers, masons' helpers. They're slaves who were working in the John Stevens shop doing some of the preliminary carving of gravestones. There were slaves who were making chocolate in Newport. And here in Wickford, though, the vast majority of the male slaves, because of what was going on here, were trained to be merchant seamen. And so they were rented out to ship's masters in the off seasons, and they would go out to sea and be on those ships as crew members on the ships. And in this reality, of course, he never got a dime for any of that time while he was a slave. The Smith family did, but he got something special. He got a marketable skill. So when he was freed, he was not only was he an accomplished mariner, but he was also well known by the ship's owners that worked in and out of Wickford. And he immediately got work. And he got to keep the money. And he started making money. He started being able to support his family. And I've counted at least 25 men like Domini, men who learned this trade of being a mariner while there were slaves who were freed and then went on and were able to take care of their families in that fashion. So what's this got to do with the Revolution? Well, let's get to that. So we have this guy, Domini Smith, and you see the house is, again, this is a house built right after the war. Domini is living in a small place, probably down Fowler Street, because that's where a lot of the black community lived in that time frame. Going to sea, supporting his family, and doing fairly good. But as the Revolution kicked in, being on the West Bay had its advantages for ships owners, because you could still do some business, you could still make some money. Guys who were fishing could still go out to sea as long as they hugged the shoreline between Jamestown and here and didn't get anywhere near Newport. They could travel unimpeded without the British really giving them any trouble. Sometimes if there was a patrol out, they'd have to hide in a cove, but they could go about their own business. And one of the sea captains that was here was a gentleman named William Baker. Captain William Baker. He had a large ship that he would use to haul goods up and down the eastern seaboard. He would run runs into the Caribbean, back and forth, hauling product back and forth there, and he was a busy sailor. And he continued. He wanted to continue working. But as an American, he had an entrepreneurial mind too, and he realized that the British at this time were, especially after the debacle with what went on in Newport that we just talked about, were beginning to lose momentum. So what they did is they tightened the noose on the colonies. They wanted to shut the colonies' money down coming in. And they realized in New England the best way to do that was to blockade the Dutch-owned Salt Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands today. Anybody have any idea why they would want to do that?
Salt cod.
Salt, yeah. Fishing was one of the major industries in New England, and you can't transport fish all over the place if you can't preserve it. And the only way to preserve it in the time frame was salting it. So they knew they were going to shut down the economies of New England if they could stop the colonists, who were revolting against them from getting salt to continue this industry. So Baker, who knew some of his relatives were fishermen, he saw this terrible problem, but in his mind, it was not a problem, it was an opportunity. He said, I am going to get a ship together, I'm going to sneak out of the Narragansett Bay, we're going down to the Salt Islands, we are going to run the blockade, we're going to get into the Turks and Caicos where they are dying to sell salt because the British are blockading their island. we'll get a shipload of salt at a great price, we'll run the blockade, and we'll come back up here to the Narragansett Bay, and we will sell that salt, and we will be rich. So he went around to all the crew members and said, who's with me on this idea? And of course they thought, well, this is kind of crazy, Bill. But he got a whole crew together, and guess what the largest portion of the people who raised their hand said, I'm going with you, Bill? Black mariners. Black mariners said, what have I got to lose? This is the opportunity of a lifetime, because I'm going to get a crewman's share that will be substantial. And indeed, that's what he did. Dome and I signed on, made 2 or 3 runs to the Salt Islands on the Baker ship, and got his share. Ship's share typically goes like this. A quarter of the profits of a run go to the captain. A quarter of the profits go to the ship. Oftentimes the captain owned the ship, so he got half of it, and the other half of the profits was divided up among the crew. So by the end of the days, Baker makes a lot of money. And this is just one example of what being in Wickford allowed them to do. A safe, protected harbor. The British never got in here, and we'll talk about how they did that at another stop. And they were able to do what they wanted to do here. And so Wickford prospered during the Revolution because of these kind of things. And not only did Baker prosper, but all of these ship's crewmen that went with him prospered too. There wasn't a lot of house building going on during the Revolutionary War period, as you can imagine. That's why you see so many houses that show up in Wickford with dates immediately after the war was done. So as soon as the war was done, Dome and I Smith took all the monies he had made hauling salt with Bill Baker and had this fine house constructed. And he lived in this house for the remainder of his days. His son had the house afterwards, and then when his son decided to sell it, he sold it to another black family. And eventually, this was a house that supported 3 black families, and you wouldn't think of black people in the 1700s and early 1800s being able to have such a fine house. But indeed, because of the opportunities that were here in Wickford, they were able to.
Did he get all his money based on one trip, or did he make
No, he made multiple trips. Yep, he made multiple trips. But the salary for doing these dangerous trips was quadruple or more of what he would get on a regular run during non-war times. So he was able to sock away enough money to have this house constructed. And imagine moving in day for a man who 15 years earlier had been a slave. Imagine the pride in his family at that moment when they move into this.
Was his family accepted into the town?
Yes. It was interesting, he was accepted in the community because it's a maritime community at the time frame, and it was great for blacks, even the slaves. When that last line was cast off, no longer were you judged by the color of your skin, you were only judged by your ability as a sailor and I was a merchant seaman myself, so everybody has to do their job or you won't come home alive. So all these black sailors, they were valued because they were good, and that's all they had to do. So when that last line was cast off, they were no longer black men, they were sailors just like the rest of them. So they had a great time.
Trips in like wooden schooners?
Yes, yep. Usually sloops and schooners that sailed out of Wickford, large sloops and large schooners, some brigs too, but they all sailed out of Wickford, and in this case, great opportunities.
When he came back, did he just have like a bag of coins, or how did they?
Usually, the Wickford had a lot of banks, and so you would eventually many of those banks issued their own money at that time frame. The federal government hadn't gotten ramped up at that time, and they were paid off by the banks, or they had credit at the banks, so they could do things like that. All right, we're going to go around the corner and go to the old Narragansett Church. Okay, this is the old Narragansett Church. It has this very cryptic sign on it. That's why I usually stop. People aren't familiar with it, look at that and go, what the heck does that mean? And what is it telling us? That this church was constructed in 1707 at the request of the wealthy members of the Narragansett planters who were here in southern Rhode Island, running what was really a plantation economy here. I like to think of them as agribusinesses. And the scale of these agribusinesses is hard for us to fathom, but here's the easiest way for me to put it together for you. After the King Philip's War occurred, so we're talking about the very beginnings of the 1700s, this place that used to be called the Narragansett Country, because this was the homeland of the Narragansett people, was then renamed the vacant Narragansett lands for obvious reasons. During the war, the Narragansett people were deprived of their homeland. It was taken from them by the colonists who were here. So what are you going to do with this? It it was identified at that time, even in the times of Verrazano coming here in the 1500s, as the most fertile section of land on the entire northeastern seaboard, and it truly was. And the Narragansett people were farming it, and very, very successfully, and it's part of the reason they were the powerhouse of New England at the time frame of first contact, because they were so good at farming the land, and they had such wonderful, fertile farmland. So after the war, the British had ideas about the land. They indeed were at this time beginning to ramp up in the Caribbean after they had taken the Caribbean islands away from the Spanish and the Dutch and all the other European powers that had taken those islands in the beginning. They had all those Caribbean islands largely under their own control, and they also came to the understanding, the realization that there was enormous money to be made in refined sugar. And those Caribbean islands were absolutely perfect for growing sugarcane. And indeed, I like to think about the refined sugar in that time frame in the first part of the 1700s as being like crack cocaine. I mean, there was so much money to be had by the British government with these islands that they didn't even want to plant anything there other than sugarcane. Every arable acre of land on these islands they wanted planted in sugarcane, because they knew that as soon as you got refined sugar in your tea, you were never going back. That's it. That's what you were going to want. And they were making oodles of money with this. And indeed, it was financing the British Empire in the first 3/4 of the 1700s, the sugar money that was coming out of there. And if you go and travel on these islands, you see some of the old sugar mills are still up there. And they give you a kind of a half-hearted story about what they were all about. But the sugar was all run by slave plantations, and many of the folks who were running these sugarcane plantations were connected not only in London, but also in Newport. So the Newport businessmen who were involved in that, and the people in London who wanted the money to continue to flow, realized we can't continue this way because we don't have enough acreage to grow crops to feed the slaves, and we don't have enough fields to grow hay to feed the animals. We don't have enough food. What are we going to do to continue to support the Caribbean sugarcane industry and not to limit any of our acreage, put anything else in there? And they said, the vacant Narragansett lands, it's perfect. So what did they do? They gave over the vacant Narragansett lands, which consists basically of everything from North Kingstown all the way to the border of Westerly. Everything we think of as South County was part of the vacant Narragansett lands. An enormous piece of property. Think about how big that is, how many towns are in that now. They gave most of that over, other than the coastal communities that existed, to 13 or 14 families. So think about that. All of South County was owned by 13 or 14 families. And they had plantations. The small ones were 700 and 900 acres. The Robinsons, for instance, down in South Kingstown Center, where the Bay campus is now, 2,200 acre plantation. The Updikes, they had about 1,900 acres of land. On and on it went. They owned all of South County, and they decided they wanted a church. We're doing a lot for you in London. We want a church. So they petitioned for the church, and London wanted to keep them happy, so the church was, a minister was sent and a church was constructed. Now, as I said, this was all of South County, and Wickford wasn't even here yet at this time frame. 1707 is even 2 years before they started scratching ground here. The church was placed out in what is now Slocum on Shermantown Road out there, which was kind of dead center in the Narragansett planter world. So all these families could come and go to church on Sunday, bring their family, bring their workers, bring their slaves, and all go to church. So this church sat out there from 1707, closed down during the Revolutionary War because indeed it was the Church of England, and reopened after the war, after a period of time as the former Anglicans here in New England reorganized into the American Episcopal Church. So this church is closed for a while, and indeed served as a barracks for people who were serving against the British in the area but didn't have family to stay with. So in a way, another ironic way, the Church of England became a barracks for soldiers fighting against the British. So the building itself has a great story. In 1800, it was reset up here because Wickford was at that time the center of South County Universe, and it was reopened and it became the Episcopal Church. But what I really want to think about, now that you know this little story about this building and how it ended up going from Slocum to Wickford, is what this meant to people. And remember, I told you in the beginning, 140 years we were part of the British Empire. And for 70 years, as you can see, for 70 years this church was the church that most people went to. And indeed, Wickford didn't even have enough critical mass to even support its own church. There were no churches in the village of Wickford until after the Revolution. After the Revolution, you eventually had a Quaker meeting house, then this church, then a Baptist church. But just wasn't enough critical mass to support churches in the village. So people would travel from Wickford out to Slocum to go to this church. And the church was not only the center of their spiritual world, but it was also the center of their social life. So for all those generations, the church was where they met people. The church was where you met your future wife. The church is where women got together and talked about their days and about their problems, about their issues, and shared ideas. The church is where men got together and shared stories and indeed sometimes complained about problems they had with their slaves. So the church was not only their spiritual center, but it was their social center. So when this church closed in the Revolution, and indeed the preacher here, whose name was Reverend James Fairweather, at the beginning of the Revolution, he indeed privately was, he had been here most of his life. He was indeed privately was in favor of the Revolution, but he had sworn not only an oath when he became a priest to the Anglican Church, but also to the King of England. And he felt like he could not back down on those oaths, and that's why he closed the church down. Even he realized the Revolution was the right thing to do. But closing the church was the only thing that he could do. And again, so these folks in 1776 lost their religious place to go for their spiritual health, but they also lost the place where they had their social life centered upon it. So it was a very difficult time for them. And it really shows why there was such an incredible drive after, and this didn't just happen here, but anywhere a Church of England was, to get together and redevelop something to take the place of the Anglican Church in New England, and that's how the American Episcopal Church, that's the roots of it all. It's a great place to come. They do have services here in the summer, and if you ever have an interest, it's exactly as it would have been in 1800 when it was here. There's no electricity, there's no heat, and the services are given in the Old English, and the priests wear vestments from the 1800s. Fun thing to do. It's an interesting thing to go and see. So,
did they deconstruct this building to move it?
Yes, they did. They took it apart. There's legends out there that they stole it in the night and hauled it here with oxen, but no, there's not enough oxen to haul this thing. It's a good story, but that's all it is a story. When the church was a major restoration was done in the late 1900s, like about 1980, 1990, and I was in there looking at this, and you could actually see joiners marks, two sets of joiners marks on all the major structural beams there. And a joiner's mark is put together by the people, because every beam is an individual thing. Each thing only goes into one joint, and so they're like an erector set. So you put them together correctly. So the joiners, when they took it apart in 1800, made their own set of marks so it could go back together. They know how to put it back together. So it definitely was taken apart and moved.
When did they start using it for like a graveyard?
Soon after in 1800, there's an even larger graveyard at the site where this church used to be that has all colonial era graves around it. It's a remarkable graveyard if you like old graveyards, and some beautiful stones there.
That they don't still use it.
The church?
No,
Yes, they do. Yep.
they do.
They still use it. This is an active cemetery. Most of the folks who get buried here are retired Episcopal priests and their families. Yep. Okay, we're going to head down the Greenway, and we'll talk a little bit more about the impact on families at our next stops. This is a really good place for us to talk about the impact of the Revolution on individual families, because really that was the most important thing in a place like this back then. I mean, major battles weren't fought here in Wickford. Stuff was going on all around them. They were hearing about things. They were knowing what was going on. Their menfolk were out fighting battles here and there. The men who were of age to go to war. There were things they couldn't get anymore. Their life was a little harder. But at the beginnings of it all, this decision by this band of colonies to break away had incredible impacts upon individual families. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. And we can see this is the house built by Robert Potter. And Robert Potter was one of the earliest house wrights in the area, and many of the houses that date to the Revolutionary War period of time, he built them. He was an incredibly gifted house wright, and he built this house, the place we're going to stop next, which is the tavern, the Narragansett Tavern. He constructed that. The Wickford house across the way, he constructed that. This guy was an incredible, incredible house wright. He was an important member of the community. He was in leadership positions in the community. He was well respected in the community. Everybody loved him. He only had one problem. When the war came along, he was convinced that his family owed a loyalty to the crown, and he just wasn't going to have it. So he did what many families did at that time frame. The family was torn apart by it all. Members of his family's brothers, his brother who ran that place originally, David Potter, he was for the revolution. Other families were the same way. The Boone family, another family that was here in Wickford and had been here again since the very beginnings. You know, they're 140 years served as members of the crown. They too were just torn apart by the loyalties to either the crown or the revolution. What were they going to do? And the families would get together and just think about the torment that they went through. I mean, we have kinds of similar things going on now today as we have such a difference of opinion, such a division over how things should be in America, and there's families who are stuck in the middle of that as well. But this was even worse because this was a serious thing, and the people who were loyal to the crown were literally concerned for the well-being and the life of their relatives who were in the revolution. They didn't want to see their brother hung. They didn't want to see their father hung. They didn't want to see their sons hung by the British if the war went bad. And so they were all struggling with this. Robert Potter finally took his family and left. This is a guy who was just revered in the community, who had built all the major houses, who had been involved in local government, who had done this all. He finally made a conscious decision that his loyalties were with the crown. Half of the Boone family, the same thing, they left. They went to Canada. And that's what many of these families did. They had to decide what side of this argument are you going to stand on, and families were torn apart by it. Indeed, other families, we had families who were looking at and actually turning in their relatives. The Allen family is a perfect example of that. Judge John Allen was an ardent supporter of the revolution. He lived up in the Quidnesset area. His cousin Mansfield Allen, who also lived in the Quidnesset area, was all for the revolution, or all for the crown, and he knew that his cousin had a great boat. Mansfield was also kind of a conniver, and he thought he could make some money with his brother's boat. So he went up to his brother John and said, I think we can make a lot of money, John, if we use your boat to haul confiscated foodstuffs from the West Bay over to Newport and offload them there. They'll pay us good money. And John said, I am not going to support the British. You can forget it, Mansfield. Get the heck out of here. Get out of my sight. And Mansfield was angry about it because he saw dollar signs, and his brother would have none of it, so he went over to the British and turned his own brother in. And indeed, the Allen house, which is now located where Quonset Davisville is, the British came over and in retribution torched his house, took John Allen and hauled him off in chains and put him on a prison ship in Newport Harbor, where he nearly perished. So families were being torn apart by decisions made about the revolution, and I think that it's something that we have to understand. It's so easy to think, yeah, well, the Tories and their loyalists are the bad guys, but they were just all regular people trying to come to grips with what was going on in their world. And their world had been like that, as I said, for some of them for 5 generations, for 140 years. This was the world that they knew, and it was all changing. And again, we go back to the Franklin quote, once the die is cast, you had to make a choice. You either hang together or you're going to hang separately. And the ones who wanted to stay were going to stay and fully support the revolution, and the ones who weren't in it left and went to Canada. There's colonies in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Indeed, the Boone family has just as big a family burial plot in New Brunswick as they have here in Wickford. Many of these folks were considered traitors, and indeed one of the heads of both the Potter and the Boone family laws were passed with numbers of people saying you can never come back to Rhode Island. So they're in Canada hoping that things will settle down, and they come back and see their sons and daughter-in-laws, for instance, back here in Wickford, and they're told, no, you're a traitor, you're never allowed to come back. So they lived their lives in that fashion, and it was a very difficult time for everybody. So it wasn't just as cut and dried as we might think, especially most of us here are baby boomers, and the little storybooks that we were told as kids that everybody knew exactly what they wanted to do and it was all great. It really wasn't all great. It was difficult. It was heart-wrenchingly difficult for some of these families to make these choices. And indeed, families were changed forever. And some of the things that you see with New England families, with names, for instance, the Gardner family, there's many different spellings for some of these names, the Pierce family, the Northup family. These spelling changes actually happened, many of them, in the time of the Revolution, when somebody who was a revolutionary actually changed some way the spelling of their name so they wouldn't be connected with the ones who were loyalists. So Gardners formerly were spelled without an I. Then the ones who stayed behind added an I, became Gardiner. So, and Pierces spelled their names EI, and some of them went by IE, some went to EA. Northrops had an R, some of them, and I don't know which way it went, but I think the Northrops who stayed put the R in, and the Northups who left kept it out. So it really was that divisive a time for folks, and a very difficult time indeed for everybody. So when we think about these people and what they went through here in a village like Wickford, where there was no big battle, there was a constant battle going on in the hearts of families up and down all these streets. So we're going to move.
Tim,
just.
Why is it that they settled to go to Canada rather than going back to England? Is there a reason?
They didn't. Many of them had no connections at all in England, and going back to England, they would have no opportunities. The British were giving land to folks who were ready to leave in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to try to beef up the settlements in the area. So they were going to get a free place to start a new life, essentially. We're just going to go down the way and talk about this building built by Potter before he left. Okay, this is an interesting place, the Potter Dean Tavern, also called the Narragansett Tavern, as you can see by the sign. It, along with the Wickford House, were two of the earliest taverns, and they were here in the colonial period and through the Revolution. This particular one was known as a place where men would sign up for the war. And I think it's important to think about this, that again, where there were quotas required of each community, so many people had to sign up from North Kingstown, so many people had to sign up from East Greenwich, et cetera, and each place had a location where people would go and sign up. And this was indeed the place that this happened, in the tavern house. At that time, the tavern was run by John Mowry. He purchased it after the Potter and Dean family left here. Indeed, David Potter, who was the brother of Robert, he left the area after, went to some place in New York State, probably to get away from the conflict that was going on here in New England, fearing that he wanted to get to a quieter place, and also probably not wanting to live next door to the house of his brother, who his brother left and went away and went to Canada and never returned. But John Mowry took over the tavern. He was the tavern keeper here at the time frame when this was being set up as a place where the men from North Kingstown would come and register to serve in the Army or the Navy or whatever unit that was being filled out at that time frame. So it was a busy place during the Revolution, but it was also a busy place, as I said, because Wickford, as we talked, was largely unscathed during the period of war time. And what happened in this time frame was Newport businessmen who had connections here and who weren't loyal to the crown were sneaking out and moving over here, bringing their business, bringing their money, bringing their wealth, bringing their families, and settling in Wickford. Business was still being done even surreptitiously. People who were living in Newport would come to taverns like this and set up business arrangements. So Wickford continued to prosper and prosper. And indeed, after the war was over, and of course the British, when they were finally driven out of Newport, they were sore losers, and they pretty much destroyed the city. They burned much of the city and caused great damage to the infrastructure of Newport. And Newport took years to recover after the Revolutionary War. But Wickford was unscathed. We already, because of what happened in the war, we already had this Newport business connections going on here, and we had this great harbor that didn't have any sunken ships in it, blockading it or anything like that, and business in Wickford just took off. It slowly ramped up during the Revolution, but when the Revolution was over, Wickford just took off. People who had money and saved it began building houses, and if you take a look at the dates of houses, you see a very slow, steady increase throughout the colonial period, and then you see just pretty much a flat line during the Revolution as far as building in the community. And then after the Revolution, Wickford just jumps and it takes off because Newport is in a rebuilding phase. Things can't happen here. There's shipwrecks in the harbors that the British sunk there that had to be cleared out. Wickford Harbor is here. Business is humming. Money is coming in. Churches are being built, houses are being built, banks are opening up here, and Wickford becomes the financial and commercial center of the lower Narragansett Bay until years later when Newport finally gets back on its feet again. But Wickford then took off, and this period of time is when Wickford became the Wickford that we all know and love today largely. Many of these houses were constructed in the 20 or 30 years after the Revolution, when that big influx of money and business was going on here, and there was nowhere else for business to occur but here. Okay, any questions about that? All right, let's head down the road a little bit. Okay, this is the old Narragansett Bank House, and this is another one of those buildings that has tons and tons of stories connected with it. I can go on and talk about Benjamin Fowler and the beginnings of some of banking here, and Benjamin's sister who ran a woman-owned business here in the 1700s. But today we're going to talk about the guy who had the house built, Samuel Bissell, 1768, and his house was half of this house. It was a house like some of the ones we have gone by, kind of a salt box style house. It was a small house. Bissell was here because he was a blacksmith. And if you take a look at Wickford in this time frame, it amazed me when I first started looking. I didn't know any better about what was going on here, how many blacksmiths there were in Wickford. I mean, how many horseshoes do you need? I used to think to myself, how many blacksmiths do you need? But really, the blacksmiths that were here in Wickford, who were coming here in droves, there were more than a half a dozen working blacksmiths in the village at any given time. Most of them were working for the shipbuilding trade, making stuff to build ships. Spikes and nails, you know, the kinds of things that you need to build and construct a ship. The bands that would be used to hold the masts in place. Specialized blacksmiths who were just doing this special work under contract to shipyards that were in the area. And indeed, at its peak, Wickford had 5 different shipyards ringing this, essentially an island where shipbuilding was what it was all about here. And these blacksmiths and all the other kind of tradesmen that were required for a really vigorous shipbuilding trade, you know, folks who were rope makers and folks who were making sails and all the other kind of things, master kind of woodworkers and joiners, they were all coming to Wickford because the work was here. So Samuel Bissell is a blacksmith. He had a blacksmith shop over near an area now called Bissell's Coves, down near where the Hamilton Elementary School is, and he lived here. His shop was making stuff for the shipbuilding trade. Maybe he shoot an occasional horse, I don't know, but that wasn't his bread and butter. And he too was involved in the Revolution. And he was in a group of people who were working here as a militia to try to take care of the area. All the men who were of age were off to war, and you had a militia here called the Newtown Rangers, which was a group of men who were a little bit too old to go off and fight the war, but Wickford needed to be protected, and Sam was one of those members in the Newtown Rangers. And their job was to defend Wickford Harbor and to join up with other similar militias as needed to help defend the coastline of the West Bay so the British didn't come over here, because they were coming over here all the time. As time went on, they ran out of stuff to feed their men, the Germans and the British regulars that were over there in Newport. And they began doing raids on the West Bay to try to steal livestock, to steal food, to continue to feed the British. And so, rightfully so, the powers that be in the state of Rhode Island said, we'll starve those British out. We want to have every place where they might try to steal stuff protected. And indeed, the Newtown Rangers were part of that. They were given a cannon by the new government of the state of Rhode Island now, and that cannon set at the very end of Poplar Point, right where the Poplar Point lighthouse is now, if you can picture that in your mind, facing out the harbor. From that higher level on the Poplar Point lighthouse, you could see any ship approaching Wickford Harbor, and the channel there, and the depth of the channel there that a British ship could get in was very narrow, 15, 20 feet across, so it was easy to protect the harbor. And British attempted to come over here a number of times and were repulsed by the Newtown Rangers and the Wickford gun. They turned around, they went elsewhere. They'd go up the bay, up to areas that were less protected, like some of the lightly settled areas in what's now Quidnesset, or going up into some of the lightly settled areas in East Greenwich, and tried to steal food from those areas. But they never got through by the Newtown Rangers and the Wickford gun. And Sam Bissell was a part of that. As a blacksmith, it was his job to keep that gun going well. So as the story goes, a British warship called the Coyote was down near Point Judith. The captain of that ship was inexperienced, and he ran it aground off Point Judith. It was a full-scale British warship, and it was something that every one of these militiamen, these guys who wanted to be in the war, but who were here protecting their harbors, wanted a piece of. And indeed, the Newtown Rangers wanted it too. So what they did is they said, along with all the other ones, the ones from East Greenwich, the ones from South Kingstown, etc., they were all heading towards Point Judith because they wanted to sink that British ship while it was still stuck in the mud off of Point Judith. So they got together, the guys went over to the gun, hooked it up to a team of oxen, and ready to haul it down to Point Judith as fast as they could so they could have a piece of the action down there to sink that warship. And as they were doing that, they noticed something. That somebody in the night before, a Tory sympathizer, a loyalist in the area, had taken an iron spike and driven it into the touch hole of the cannon, which is where you put the charge that you touch with the fire, so it'll shoot the cannonball out. It was jammed with this iron spike. So the leader of the group, George Waite Babcock, he was the head of the group at this time. He said to his guy closest to him, he said, "Go get Sam Bissell. We're going to get going. We're going to go get underway. We're going to get this cannon on its way to Point Judith. Get over there any way you can and get Sam and get him on the way to meet up with us. We need to get this cannon operable by the time we get to Point Judith." Now, if you think about Poplar Point, it wouldn't be as simple as it is today. There was no Hussey Bridge to go across. So you got to go from Poplar Point. You have to drive down. You have to run down on your horse from Poplar Point, head south till you get to Anaquatucket, what's now Anaquatucket Road. Go all the way down Anaquatucket Road. You get it then onto the Boston Post Road, come down to what is now Phillip Street, and come down into Wickford to get here. So it was a long journey. So he got on his horse as fast as he could, because that's what Babcock had told him to do, and he raced over here, knocked on the door, got Sam. Sam got on his horse, and they raced back, heading towards the cannon, which was going down Boston Neck, down the Boston Neck Road, heading to Point Judith. When they got there, the gun was only a few miles outside of Wickford. He got there very quickly, but it still had a long way to go to Point Judith, and the thing was still stuck. Now, picture, this is kind of a comical scene. Sam Bissell has a toolkit with him in a bag, and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to stop. They want to get there before somebody else sinks the British ship. So he straddles this cannon, which is being hauled by 2 teams of oxen going down the bumpiest damn road in the world. He's on this cannon, bent over, bouncing around with you know, his family jewels there, trying to clear out this hole, you know, while they're bouncing down the road. And the other guy grabbed Sam's horse, and they made it all the way down there. Sam bouncing on the cannon all the way down to Point Judith. When he gets there, he got the touch hole cleared out, and then they were able, actually, the Newtown Rangers are credited with sinking the British ship. So now Sam Bissell probably walks back to the house. But once he's healed up a little bit, he gets to go down to the tavern with Tom Cole and Sam Phillips and be a hero and tell his story. So he too was one of the guys who individually made a difference in the war effort and allowed this group of older men to have their day of glory in sinking a British ship. And of course, some of their sons would come back and they would have been off and done maybe a whole bunch of nothing, but they go, hey, well, we just sunk a British warship yesterday, but I know you were down in Boston Neck in your camp waiting for something to happen. We made something happen. So old people are, we can get it done, you know. Okay, this is our last stop, and this one is kind of personal to me. I have a lot of stories with Old Yellow that are personal, but this one's kind of interesting because at the beginning of the revolutionary period, this house was owned by a gentleman named Thomas Cranston. And it's interesting because at this time frame, there were 2 Tom Cranstons living in North Kingstown. This Thomas Cranston, who was a wealthy Newport businessman who came here to get out of Newport, and the Thomas Cranstons I'm related to, whose family we had come here to North Kingstown earlier, and who was signed up, went down to the tavern there and signed up when he was 17-year-old and served with distinction in the Revolutionary War. So we got 2 Tom Cranstons here, and this Tom Cranston story is kind of another great one for us to talk about with the idea of what's going on between loyalists and revolutionaries. Now, this Tom Cranston here had a father named Tom Cranston, so we're going to get real confusing with Tom Cranstons. And that particular Tom Cranston was an important guy during the colonial period. That Tom Cranston, first and foremost, was the grandson of Samuel Cranston, who I'm also related to, who was the colonial governor of Rhode Island, elected to the governorship of Rhode Island more than anybody in the history of the United States of America. This guy must have loved politics. 29 times he was elected to be a governor. 29 times. And he did everything in his life was about being prepared to rule the colony of Rhode Island. He had an arranged marriage set up for him when he got to be of age, because the leaders in Newport, where he was from, were beginning to fear that there was beginning to be too much political energy coming out of Providence, and so they decided we need to make sure we can get some Providence freeman votes so we can continue to control this colony. So Sam Cranston was married off to Roger Williams' granddaughter, so there's political connections for you. So I get to call myself Roger Williams, my 14th grandfather, but the reality was that it was really about political connections and about Newport wanting to keep power. So Sam, he becomes, essentially he was Rhode Island, and indeed he ruled Rhode Island for all those years, and he died in office, and he would have been reelected more times if he had lived longer. So this Tom Cranston's father is his grandson, and he went into politics. He followed in his grandfather's footsteps and became a politician in the colonial period. Eventually he became the Speaker of the House for the colonial government of Rhode Island. At the same time, and no problem with separation of church of state offices. He was also the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for Rhode Island. I don't know how that works. Get to be run the House, and the House of Representatives is the power structure in Rhode Island, and he's the Chief Justice. I don't know how that works, but that's what he was. So he was a very powerful man. But he had one shortcoming. He was a loyalist. And he was living in Newport. He is one of the most prominent figures in Newport at that time frame, Tom Cranston. He actually had so much power in the colony of Rhode Island that he's the guy who said, well, when you break off that southern part of province and make a new town, you're going to have to name it after my grandfather, Cranston, Rhode Island. So that's how we ended up with that. So he was a very powerful figure in the colony of Rhode Island. And as the revolution came on, he was against it. He walked around Newport talking about this and saying, what's wrong with you people? We're the part of the British Empire. Look how good we are. Look at Newport. You think Newport will be Newport without our connections to England? Are you nuts? He talked about it, he talked about it, he talked about it. And again, just like over there where we talked about Cutler and we talked about George Room and we talked about other smaller families who didn't have the kind of prominence, it was a problem in the Cranston family. What are we going to do about old Tom? He just keeps talking about how crazy we are to be in this revolution. You know, this is the Tom that I'm related to. This is his uncle, and this is my uncle is nuts. He's over in Newport. He's talking about this stuff, and for his son who lives here, he's like, my dad is off his rocker. What is he doing? But you know, the government of the new state of Rhode Island had a problem. Tom Cranston was just too well loved in the state, and he was too connected to Sam Cranston, so they couldn't just take all his stuff and sell it off and then drive him out. But they have to shut him up because he's the kind of person that people are going to listen to, and they don't want to have him continuing to flap his gums like that. So something had to be done. So what happened is the new government of the state of Rhode Island, at its very beginning, one of its first issues it dealt with in those first few difficult months was the Tom Cranston problem. What are we going to do with him? You know, it's like Roger Williams. You know, the English couldn't kill Roger Williams. He was too well connected. So they cast him off into the Narragansett country. Well, that's indeed what they had decided to do with Tom Cranston Sr. They hauled him before the government of the new state of Rhode Island and said, Tom, we love you, buddy. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but you just keep talking trash and we don't want to hear it anymore. We're not going to take all your stuff. And Tom had a lot of stuff. He was well connected in Newport. He had lots of property. He had important businesses. And like a good Rhode Island politician, he was connected all over the place. They didn't take his stuff. They didn't throw him out of the new state of Rhode Island, but they said, here's your option, Tom. One, we do take all your stuff and we throw you out. Or two, you go down to your son's house in Wickford under house arrest, you stay inside for the rest of the revolution, you don't open your mouth, you don't say a word. If we hear you're on the streets in Wickford talking against the revolution, we're going to come down, we're going to get you, and we are going to take your stuff. So Tom didn't really have much option, Tom Sr., and Tom Jr. probably was like, oh, thanks a lot. You know, because now you got this pariah living in your house with you that nobody likes. He's not allowed to go outside, so the missus probably had to probably entertain her father-in-law all the time. As the war went on, you know, and it became clear that the revolution was going to succeed, Tom Sr., like a good politician, had a change of heart. You know, maybe I was wrong about that. I think that the revolution is a great thing, and he went back up to Newport, went before the government and said, I was wrong, I think this is wonderful, and he was allowed to go free and continue his life. So, kind of a crazy thing, but you know, these are the kinds of decisions that had to be made in this early time as Rhode Island was struggling with all these obligations. How do we manpower ourselves? How do we pay for ourselves? What do we do about prominent people with big mouths? All of these decisions had to be figured out by this group of folks who were just barely beginning to control the state, who were all worried about whether they're going to hang separately, like Ben Franklin said, or whether they're going to hang together and start a new nation. So that's the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any further questions, I really wanted you to understand the challenges that regular people had with the Revolutionary War, and I hope that it give you something else to think about.